Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we will be discussing Chapter 2 of my college-level sociology course. First, we will start off with a brain warm-up, so that you all can get prepared to think like sociologists.
Wow!
What do you think about the following statement? People can find data to support any opinion they have. Let me know in the comments down below what you all think about this statement. And now we'll get started with Chapter 2, which is based on the foundations of sociology research and where it starts off. So, the beginnings of sociology research is known to be based on knowledge, and much of our knowledge is based on tradition. Tradition is a handing down of statements, beliefs, and customs from generation to generation. And an example of this is the fact that it's always the groom's parents in a wedding who pay for the rehearsal dinner. Another source of knowledge is authority. Authority is a socially accepted source which includes experts on the topic. And experts can include anyone from judges, police officers, government officials to religious leaders who have a lot of expertise in a specific topic. This knowledge is simple and it simplifies our lives because it provides us basic rules about what is socially and what is legally acceptable behavior. Sociologists rely on research methods, which are organized systematic procedures, to gain knowledge about a particular topic, to go more detailed into a nuanced depth into a topic. For example, research shows that neither ignoring a problem nor inflicting physical punishment like spanking stops a toddler's bad behavior. Instead, most young children's misbehavior can be curbed by having simple rules, being consistent in disciplining misbehavior, praising good behavior, and setting a good example. This is the knowledge that is socially and legally acceptable behavior. Sociological research also is especially useful because it counteracts misinformation, it exposes myths, and it sharpens critical thinking skills. It also helps explain why people behave the way they do. And it also affects social policies by using research results to find out which policies work, which do not, and which policies are better off being implemented. An example of sociology at work is the topic of fake news. Fake news is misinformation that deliberately misleads people for financial, political, or other gain, and it has been around for a long time. And approximately 80% of Americans are confident that they can identify this fake news. However, many of us are susceptible to a type of bias called confirmation bias, which is a tendency to remember and recall information that confirms our beliefs and ignores or downplays evidence that doesn't support the contrary, which goes back to the brain teaser I first started my lesson with. And sociology has allowed researchers to use the scientific method and prove to the general population that we all, in fact, are susceptible to the spread of fake news, just in different levels of belief. Sociology research comes down to mainly two different approaches. The first is deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning begins with a specific theory, prediction, or a general principle that is then tested through data collection. Inductive reasoning, on the other hand, it begins with specific observations, followed by data collection, and then a conclusion about patterns or irregularities or regularities, and the formation of a hypothesis that can lead to the construction of a theory, which starts the deductive reasoning process. And now we would like to talk about research methods, the common tools used to perform sociological research, the first of which is sampling. If a researcher was under ideal conditions, they would like to study all of the units of the population in which they're interested. For example, adolescents who use drugs. They would like to study every single adolescent who uses drugs. However, the population, which is a well-defined group of people that the researcher wants to know more about, may be so large that is most likely going to be too expensive, too time-consuming, and overall impossible to access the entire population. So that's why researchers typically find a sample of the portion, which is a group of people that is representative of the population that they wish to study. Researchers can also compare variables in two different ways. The data can be longitudinal, which is collected at two or more points in time from the same or different samples of respondents, or it can be cross-sectional, which is collected at one specific point in time. For example, one survey is cross-sectional, but a longitudinal survey would be one that is administered every week to a certain group of people to determine their progress. The biggest principle in sociology research is that correlation does not equate to causation. For example, there's so much research that shows that there is an association between alcohol abuse and domestic violence, and that the more frequent alcohol abuse happens, the greater the likelihood that domestic violence happens. Even though they often occur together, alcohol abuse and domestic violence, it doesn't mean that one specifically causes the other. Because domestic violence can occur when the person doesn't drink, and not all people who abuse alcohol become violent or aggressive. Instead, there's other factors and confounding variables that affect alcohol abuse, domestic violence, or both variables. Another major data collection method, in addition to sampling, is surveys. Many sociologists use surveys that include questionnaires, face-to-face telephone interviews, or a combination of any of these techniques. Two important elements in survey research is sampling and constructing a series of questions for respondents, the people who answer the questions. There are two types of interviews: structured interviews, which use closed-ended questions, which are like yes-no questions, or unstructured interviews, which are open-ended questions that allow respondents to answer as they wish, and in turn leads to a more subjective data. The strengths of surveys are that they are relatively inexpensive, they're simple to administer, and they have a really fast turnaround rate, because when you give a survey to someone, the chances are that they would have it completed within like 5-10 minutes is much higher. And it's also easily sent to more people. However, the limitations of surveying is that for face-to-face interviews, they can be pretty expensive, and mailed surveys have a really low response rate, which is approximately only 10%. And also, another limitation is that a survey's wording, the exact word choice and diction used in the survey, affects people's answers substantially. And let me give you an example. So, 50% of Americans agreed that doctors should be allowed to assist the patient in committing suicide, but a whopping 70% said that the doctor should be allowed to end the patient's life by some painless means, even though they both mean the same thing. There's more support behind one because of the word choice behind that. Another concern is social desirability bias, the tendency of respondents to give the answer that they think they should give, or that it will cast them in a much more favorable light. For example, the proportion of Americans who say they voted in a given election is always much higher than the actual number of votes cast. A next research method tool is field research. Sociologists in this method, they collect data by systematically observing people in their natural surroundings. The strengths of this is that it provides rich detail in describing and understanding attitudes and behavior in the real world. And since researchers don't directly influence their subjects, there is no social desirability bias because the people don't know they're being watched. The limitations of this is that observation can be very expensive because you need to house researchers and they need to perhaps live in a different society and learn new languages to live there. And also, reactivity happens. If people know that they're going to be observed, they might behave differently, so you have to be very secretive about it. For example, a study of 392 restaurants from 5 different chains found that employee theft decreased by 22% after management installed surveillance cameras, so that in that case, when people know they're being watched, they're less likely to commit risky acts. In the case of the participant observation, anything that the researcher does or doesn't do can affect what's being observed because the researcher's presence changes a group's dynamics, behavior, and outcomes. Another type of research method is known as content analysis. Content analysis systematically examines some form of communication. Researchers can apply this unobtrusive data collection method to almost any form of written or oral communication. This can include speeches, TV programs, online blogs, advertisements, songs, tweets, and you name it. And sociologists have used content analysis to examine a number of topics. A few examples are images of women and men in video games and music videos, gender biases in job advertisements. And the strengths of using content analysis is that it's very inexpensive and it's also less time consuming while also being very unobtrusive. The limitations, however, is that if you are in an ambitious project, it can be very labor intensive. For example, when researchers examined the amount and intensity of violence in children's animated movies released between 1938 and 1999, it took several years to code one or more of the major characters' words, expressions, and actions because of how many movies they had to get through. Another limitation of content analysis is that it usually reflects social class bias. And since this is a relatively difficult problem to deal with because most books, articles, speeches, films, and so forth, they're produced by people mainly in the upper socioeconomic level. And so content analysis rarely captures the behaviors or attitudes of working class people and the poor. Another very common research method is an experiment, and I'll give you the exact definition of an experiment, which is a controlled artificial situation that allows researchers to manipulate variables and measure the effects. The classical experiment design includes two equal-sized groups, a control and a experimental group, that are similar in characteristics such as gender, age, ethnicity, race, and education. And the strengths of this experiment is that it comes much closer than other data collection methods to suggesting possible cause and effect relationships, and it also can be replicated many more times with many different participants, which strengthens the research's confidence in the validity and reliability of their research. The limitation is that they have to rely a lot on volunteers or paid respondents. People know that they're going to be observed, so that results in that social bias, and many behave very differently than they would in a natural setting. The last type of research is secondary analysis. Secondary analysis is an unobtrusive data collection method that examines information previously collected by someone else. And this data may include historical materials like court proceedings, personal documents, official statistics like the US Census, and researchers with slightly different interests, they can analyze or reanalyze data that examined only specific variables in the variables collected. The strengths are that it is very accessible, convenient, and inexpensive, and it saves a huge amount of time because that is time that you would have had to spend collecting that data. The limitations, however, is that it may be challenging to access such materials because the documents may be deteriorating or part of private collections or even protected. And also, if the researcher didn't collect the data, they have no control over the specific variables used and how they were measured. Evaluation research is usually not considered a tool, but something that is used outside of research to examine whether a social intervention produces the intended result, and it's like it just evaluates programs and strategies, and it seeks to prevent or change or improve the negative outcomes that they've been receiving with that social intervention. An example includes a needs assessment study, which includes like improving or initiating a new service like an after-school program and doing cost-benefit analysis. The strengths of evaluation is that it's very versatile for including quantitative or qualitative approaches, and it addresses real-life problems that communities confront. The limitations, however, is that it can only address a few factors affecting behavior, social conflicts of interest. For example, groups that fund the evaluation may pressure researchers to present only positive findings. For example, the popular DARE program, which is drug abuse resistance education, it was introduced in 1983 to teach elementary school children about the dangers of drug use. Social scientists evaluated DARE in 1994 and 1998, and they found no significant difference in the incidence of drug use among students who had or hadn't completed the DARE curriculum. And when DARE funding was threatened, its promoters dismissed this research as voodoo science. Researchers today, however, operate on much stricter guidelines than they did in the past, and in order to even participate in any research, an agency that wishes to receive this federal research support must establish an IRB, which is an institutional review board, which is a panel of faculty and sometimes others who review all proposals involving human research subjects. And the chief purpose of this is to ensure that the subject's rights are protected and will be protected. Ethics violations are also most common when research is funded by for-profit companies and organizations. Medical researchers particularly have been accused of considerable scientific dishonesty, and some of the alleged violations have included changing research results to please the corporation that sponsored the research, which may be pharmaceutical companies, being paid by companies to deliver speeches to health practitioners that endorse a specific drug even though when it hasn't been proven yet or it doesn't reduce any health problems, and also even allowing drug manufacturers to edit articles published in prestigious medical journals and falsifying the data. And just like that, we have wrapped up Chapter 2. Be on the lookout for Chapter 3. Thanks and have a great day. Bye.